Welcome back, everyone, to Chapter 1. This is going to be the second video for Chapter 1. And now that we kind of had a nice historical lesson on the study of behavior, we're now going to focus in on the school of behaviorism and talk about the 5 different schools of behaviorism that are around. Now, all of these schools of behaviorism still have support today. Some people prefer one school over another. There's support for all of them, but there's also disadvantages to all of them. And you'll kind of understand that kind of stuff as we go through all of them. So, all of these schools of behaviorism are based on a somewhat different set of assumptions about what's the best way to study those environmental influences on behavior. So again, we're really focusing on the environment's effect on behavior because remember, John Watson was really influenced by those British empiricists. So the first school of behaviorism, it was actually founded by John Watson. And so this is methodological behaviorism. And this is actually thought to be the most extreme school of behaviorism. And that's because this school says that psychologists should only study the behaviors that can be directly observed. So if you can't see it with your eyes, don't study it. That's what this is saying. It also says that there's no effect of your internal feelings, your internal thoughts, your internal processes on your behavior. It's saying that the environment affects behavior, and that is it. It's just the environment dictates all. Okay, so that's what methodological behaviorism is saying. Now, another way to look at it is by looking at the stimulus-response theory. So Watson developed this theory, and he was really inspired by Pavlov because this was occurring about the same time or a little bit after classical conditioning was really taking off and really was being talked about. So what Watson did was he took this idea of a stimulus and a response, so stimulus is S, response is R, and he applied it to his methodological behaviorism. So here, the stimulus is what was that environmental event is now our stimulus, and that leads to a response. So a response, that's that observable behavior there. But again, you can see that internal events are having no effect. You've got a stimulus that leads to a response, and that is it. Now, Watson was a real stickler for this idea of empiricism, that there's the tabula rasa, that the environment affects behavior, and that's it. Nothing about the persons really affecting the behavior. Behaviors develop because of outside forces. Now, later in his life, Watson did kind of change his mind. He did, he saw a lot of the work other people were doing. He read those results, and he did come to understand and agree that there is some sort of combination of both learned and innate behaviors in humans. So he did agree after a while that, there are some behaviors that aren't learned. Some behaviors occur just because we're human. But he did kind of keep to a stickler idea that in most animals, then it's just this very strict stimulus response type of behavioral event occurring. And that it was really only these more evolved humans that had these innate behaviors as well. Now, Another psychologist came after Watson, and he really wanted to challenge Watson. He didn't agree with Watson, and this was Clark Hull. So Clark Hull really challenged what Watson was saying, and he was like, no. Yeah, the environment has an effect, but you have to take into account what's happening with the person themselves, what's happening inside. And that not everything that that science acts on can be seen. So he was really looking at, like, say, gravity. Like, we know gravity's there, but you can't see it. Gravity's having an effect on behavior, but you can't see it. So therefore, there has to be other effects going on other than those that you can see. So he called this operationalized. So if something can be described as having an effect, then it can have an effect. So internal effects can be operationalized as having an effect. Gravity can be operationalized to have an effect. So he kind of changed this. So now we have a broader definition of what we can kind of study, broader definition of what can have an effect on behaviors. And Hull also really stressed those internal events, and he called these intervening variables. So these intervening variables are something that helps drive the behaviors by helping to mediate the stimulus and response. So you've still got the stimulus of the environmental effects, you've still got the response of an observable behavior, but now there's these intervening variables. And so what neo-behaviorism says is that these intervening variables are some sort of physiological process. So like hunger, fatigue, like maybe a quickened heart rate. So kind of think of like the sympathetic, parasympathetic nervous system. Those would be what neo-behaviorism says are those internal events. So it's not thoughts and feelings that are these internal events. It's the sympathetic, parasympathetic nervous system that's driving or mediating this stimulus and response. So from neo-behaviorism, we then got cognitive behaviorism. So cognitive behaviorism was first kind of described by Edward Tolman, and he really disagreed with that simple stimulus response idea. He didn't really like that. He liked Hull's idea of there being some sort of internal process mediating it, but he disagreed that it was just a physiological response. He really wanted to focus on the overall patterns of behavior and how that directed particular outcomes. And so he wanted to look at behavior in a broader sense. So rather than looking at the nitpicky little things, he wanted to kind of step back, look at the big picture, see what's going on. He also thought that these intervening variables, these internal events, weren't necessarily a physiological response, but it was more a goal-oriented behavior. So, for example, an animal is not going to do a behavior because they're hungry. They're going to do it for food. So it's not the act of hunger that's driving the behavior, but it's the reward of food that's driving the behavior. So it's a internal cognitive process. So like expectations or a hypothesis that's driving it. So it's really definitely that you want to focus on the word cognitive here. So like a thought process is the internal variable, that internal event that's supporting the environmental events that lead to an observable behavior. So a great example is that Tolman did this experiment to try to really support this idea of cognitive behavior, where he had a bunch of rats in a maze. And what he did is he had 3 groups of rats. He had one group of rats who would run the maze, and at the end of the maze, then they would get a treat or a reward. So that's this R. So this dotted line is for the rats that got a reward at the end. Great. He looked at how fast do these rats learn the maze. And then he had a second group of rats who would run the maze, but they did not get a reward at the end. And the third group was the same. So he had one group that got a reward at the end, 2 groups that did not get a reward at the end. And so here, in this first section of this graph, we're looking at the number of errors. So the more errors a rat has, the less they've learned. Okay, so as the errors go down, the more they've learned. And as I pointed out, this dotted line is the rats that got a reward. So you can see that they're learning the maze very quickly. Now these 2 groups here, so the gray line and the black line, are those 2 groups of rats that didn't get a reward. And you can see they're pretty similar. They learned the maze fine, but not nearly as well as those with a reward. Now after 10 days of learning the maze, one group of rats that didn't get a reward before, so this gray line, so no reward and now reward. So after 10 days, this group of rats now get a reward at the end of the maze. And what they saw was that these rats actually learned the maze very well. So they made very few errors within 1 day of getting a reward, suggesting that these rats, the gray line rats, they had learned the maze in the first 10 days. They just weren't motivated to do the maze well because there was no reward at the end. But now that there's a reward, they're like, no, I'm going to do it as quick as possible to get the reward. Whereas before, maybe they were just having fun wandering around. It didn't matter. There was no urgency to finish the maze in the quickest way. But now that there's a reward, there is that urgency, there is that motivation, that internal drive to finish the maze quicker and to show the learned behavior. This group of rats with the black line, they never got a reward at the end of the maze, so they just plateaued, just wandering around, just having a great time. So very interesting, and what it's showing is that the behaviors of these rats did in fact change based on that internal motivation, based on whether or not there was a reward at the end. So it wasn't that their learning changed, it's that their behavior changed. Now, the next school of behaviorism decided to be different, didn't put behaviorism in their name, very special, but it's the social learning theory. So the social learning theory was developed by this guy called Albert Bandura, and he really liked the idea of Hull's theory. So remember, Hull was neo-behaviorism. So social learning actually kind of got its start by looking at neo-behaviorism, but then trying to use that to explain human imitation. And Bandura couldn't fully explain human imitation learning using neo-behaviorism, so he developed his own school of thinking called social learning theory. So a great example of human imitation learning would be when we learn how to talk, right? We really imitate those around us. That's why people speak different languages around the world, because you learn to speak based on what you hear. You're really just imitating those around you. So that's a great example. But we also imitate behaviors. And like other than talking, like say aggression, um, empathy, all these different behaviors we can actually learn by others, by imitating what we see others do around us. And that's what Albert Bandura was really interested in. And so he developed the social learning theory that really emphasizes both the observation of behavior as well as introspection. So introspection is something we haven't really talked about with behaviorism. And that's because most behaviorists don't like introspection. They're all about, remember, looking at something and observing it. And you can't observe introspection, so we clearly can't do that. And even with Hull's idea, Hull, with neo-behaviorism, he also was like, no introspection. Because remember, his internal events were physiological. They weren't like thoughts and feelings. But that's what the social learning theory focuses on for its internal events. So if we look at this kind of diagram, you can see it's now a triangle instead of a line, whereas before we had an environmental event to observable behavior with an internal event kind of in the middle. Now you can see we've got this kind of pyramid where environmental events can affect observable behavior, but it can also affect your internal events. But your internal events can affect environment or observable behavior, and vice versa. And this is what is called reciprocal determination. So this is where everything can influence everything. And this is what social learning theory really focuses on, is that it's not just environmental effects that affect our behavior, but also what's going on. What do you feel? What are you thinking about? That can affect your behavior. But also your behavior can affect how you feel. Your behavior can affect your thoughts. But of course, your behavior can also affect your environment. Because you can act on your own environment. So that's what social learning does. So you can really see how social learning's really novel and very different than the other three schools of learning that we've talked about. And then the kind of final one we're going to talk about is radical behaviorism. Now, radical behaviorism was really led by B.F. Skinner. So B.F. Skinner, you've probably heard about before. We talked about him a lot in Psych 104. He is really kind of the creator, the pioneer for operant conditioning. So you can bet we're going to talk about him again when we get there. But he didn't just really develop operant conditioning. He also pioneered radical behaviorism. And so he said no account of what is happening inside the human body, no matter how complete, will explain the origins of human behavior. So he's really saying that internal events cannot explain behavior. Rather, internal events are something else that also need to be explained. So you can't use your thoughts and feelings to explain your behavior, but rather you need to explain both your behavior and explain your thoughts and feelings. So he's saying that your environmental events affect observable behavior and your internal events. But there's really no effect of observable behavior on internal events or vice versa. And there's really no effect of your internal events or your behavior on environment. Now, he did kind of like agree a little bit, being like, well, okay, like, I guess there can be a little bit of effect on environmental effects. And like, there's a little bit of this pyramid going on, but not much. He said it was very minimal. And that really your internal events is something that needs to be explained kind of separately than behavior. And so he actually helped produce techniques that have been known collectively as behavior modification. So that's things pretty much that we're going to learn about in this class, We're going to learn about different behavior modification techniques such as operant conditioning, classical conditioning, habituation, shaping, all of that good stuff. Really it's saying that everything comes from external forces, that the world acts upon us, we do not act upon the world. Now, using radical behaviorism, it did help create behavioral analysis. Your textbook has a section on behavior analysis. I'm not going to cover it just because we're not going to talk about it really the rest of this class. So you can read it, especially if you're interested in like clinical psychology. It's very interesting. There's also a section in the cognitive behaviorism that talks about cognitive behavioral therapy that you can look at. But again, for this class, we're not really focusing on the therapies, on the behavioral analysis. Now, the last new topic we're going to kind of cover today is just behaviorism and genetics. So we've really focused on how the environment affects behavior, a little bit about how those internal forces may mediate behavior, or in social learning theory may affect behavior directly, but we really haven't talked about genetics. So how does natural selection, how does genetics, how does all of this affect behaviorism? Now remember that behaviorism has a very strong background in empiricism, but going along, especially in history, then people have really started to accept that you need both nature and nurture to explain behavior. You need to understand both the empiricists as well as the nativists. And so one of the psychologists that really embraced the idea of combining the two was Skinner. He was still more of an empiricist. He was probably like 60% empiricist, 40% nativist, something like that. But he did acknowledge that there is some connection to natural selection when it comes to behaviorism. That there are certain behaviors that are passed down, certain behaviors that we kind of just do. So like innate behaviors. So an example would be like smiling. Everyone smiles, babies smile, even if like blind people that are born blind can still smile when they're happy. And this is something that, they can't learn that. They can't mimic it, but they still do it. And so that's an innate behavior. So obviously some things are coming along. We're not a complete blank slate when we're born. And Skinner actually really looked at this and really connected this idea of natural selection with conditioning. So especially like natural conditioning, classical conditioning. And how there's the effect of the environment on behavior and how these behaviors can be passed down. And so the stimulus would be the effects of the environment, and your response would hopefully be that you get to continue living. So that's great. So again, there is some genetic effect, but we're not really going to focus on that this class. I just wanted to touch on it. I do have a background in biology, so I like to sneak in genetics whenever I can. So that's really it for chapter 1. Here's just a nice summary of what we're going to talk about, what you should really know, and what I expect you to know for this chapter. I know we covered it pretty quickly. Probably only took like an hour, hour and a half of your day. So you still have plenty of time to read chapter 1, read chapter 2 if you haven't yet, and get all caught up. I like to start the first week off slow, and then we'll really pick up next week. So in this class, we will be focusing on classical and operant conditioning. So really make sure you have a basic understanding of what that is. All of the ideas here build off the ideas presented historically. I do expect you to know the names associated with each idea, at least for the midterm. No dates. You don't need to know any dates. And then I do want you to be able to recognize, describe the 5 schools to behaviorism and their approach to learning. So that's it for chapter 1. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you guys have a great day.